Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It's good to see you here. Thank you, Dean Ayers, Alyssa, for a very, very kind introduction. Really elaborate, afraid, but thank you very much. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to be back at the Elliott School and to be back in this building. There's something very special about the school that impresses me every time I come, and that is a sense of community and warmth that is not omnipresent, let's put it this way, in every university in the world. Something very special that my predecessors created and my successors have maintained, sustained, and going even further. So it's truly wonderful to be back. And indeed, we got lost to the text now. I think that I didn't touch it for too long a time. I can do some of this by memory. When Alyssa invited me to give the keynote speech, to give the keynote speech, I could not possibly say no, because of all the jobs that I've been lucky to have. And Alyssa has mentioned many, starting as a young assistant professor at Swarthmore College, down to the exalted title of what am I, University Chair Professor at National Juncture University. I have been blessed by the opportunity to do many things in many places. But of all the jobs, and I don't always say this outside these halls, but I say it to many friends, of all the jobs I've been privileged to have, this one was the best. And it was because, first of all, something I've already mentioned, and that was the collegiality of the faculty. Their desire to build the Elliott School into an even better School of International Affairs than it was, to professionalize it, to make it more than simply 2 more years of liberal arts education. And at the same time, the dedication of the then president of the university, Steve Trachtenberg, whom I came really to admire and respect, to make the Elliott School the jewel in the crown of the university that he was trying to raise to the highest levels. So for all these reasons, this was just a wonderful, wonderful place to be. So I accepted Elisa's invitation with the greatest of pleasure, but then, I don't want to call it a panic, let's just say apprehension set in, because not only was this going to be the keynote address at a very major event, with now a longer history and a richer background than I had even imagined when I accepted the invitation. But to make a confession, I'm not an economist. And let me spend a few minutes saying why I chose not to be. And I hope I don't offend the economists in the room, but I think you'll know what I'm going to say, or understand what I'm going to say. And that is that when I went to college, I intended to major in economics and to then go off to business school, neither of which I did. What happened to the economics part of that? I remember vividly as a freshman, we called them then at UVA, we have to say first year student, I read my textbook. I'm taking the introductory, I think, combination micro-macro class. It was probably Samuelson's textbook, although I couldn't be sure. And I got to the passage that said that when the comparative advantage of organizations and countries changes, when the supply and demand curves shift, it's possible that a factory or a company will close down. And the text continues, workers will find other lines of work. And I remember thinking, I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it's that frictionless. And indeed, this was before political economy, which had been the root of the discipline in the past, was kind of restored to a prominent place. I also have a story, which I won't go into, about how slicing a plane through a 3-dimensional space, which I couldn't possibly describe, helped explain why people bought what they did. And I said, coming from an advertising family background, I don't think that's how people decide what to buy, how much to buy. It's a little more behavioral than that. And that was before, of course, the behavioral revolution in economics, which has now, I think, very happily occurred. So I was lured away by an interdisciplinary major in public and international affairs, very similar to the international affairs major here at the Elliott School. That was the right decision for me in terms of my future career path, but I didn't abandon economics altogether. I continue to take courses in various branches of economics, including international economics, and more advanced courses in micro and macro, as well as a very good course in business history, which I think has shaped me a lot as well. But I never acquired that intuitive sense of how complex economic systems work, which so many of the economists in the rooms will understand what I'm talking about and have it where I don't. So when interest rates go up, I really still have to think very carefully and logically, what does that mean for various other aspects of the economy? You know it intuitively, I don't. So that to me is when you really become an economist, and I am not that. The other thing that I did that helped kind of further develop my limited knowledge of the field was the time that I spent at the Brookings Institution. And for those of you who are Washingtonians, you may know about the Friday lunches, which were an ongoing seminar in applied economics, which developed a better understanding of some aspects of it, both internationally and domestically. So while I never gained that intuitive feel, I continue to try to develop my knowledge of the discipline and to apply it to the various issues, especially China, that I was interested in. So with that moment of panic very much from my mind, I turned to Steve Saranovic, who was at that time the director of what was then known as the ITIP program, International Trade and Investment Policy, for his guidance. Steve, what should I do? Please tell me, give me some advice. And he said, why don't you go back and look at what you've written about China over the years, and what do you see? What were you writing? What were you saying? So I was a little bit reluctant to do that because I thought that I might be ending up with a draft of my intellectual obituary in advance. But nonetheless, it was a really good exercise. And I'm going to share with you what I found, what emerged from that. What I found actually was that I had written a lot more than I had remembered, and much of it was unpublished. It was basically talks. It was proprietary papers that I'd written for various organizations. It was some, of course, published materials. So there was a lot there, and it was hard to sort it out. Excuse me. So then the question was, given this flood of writings, published and unpublished, what should I draw upon for my speech today? I had to sort it out. And so my first thought was perhaps to say, why don't I look at the ones where I was right, where I made good predictions and did good analysis. And I thought, well, that's not really very honest of me. I should give a balanced accounting of my own writings, the things I got right, the things that I clearly got wrong. So then I turned to the more scholarly approach, excuse me, which was, of course, to ask which ones have been more widely cited of those that I had published. And I found, probably the surprise of few people in the room, that there was absolutely no correlation between what was most widely cited and what I thought was my best or my favorite work. For example, what I found was what I regarded as my best book, A Fragile Relationship, the United States and China from 1972 to the mid-1990s, is not my most widely cited. That was a big surprise because that was one of my bigger books, and it's kind of up there, but it's not at the very top. And what I regard as my most important book, a conference volume called Patterns of Cooperation in the Foreign Relations of Modern China, is not cited at all. And maybe the reason for that was never published. Hard to get cited if it's not published. And what happened was a string of peer reviewers demanded multiple revisions of all the chapters to bring them up to date, which of course is a constantly receding target. And then to make things worse, they finally concluded that, well, cooperation is not really a key issue in the study of Chinese foreign relations. It should have been a book on patterns of conflict in the foreign relations of modern China. So the whole thing was deep sixed, and I really regret that. Fortunately, thanks to David Shambaugh, who's a colleague, of course, here at the Sigger Center and the Elliott School, we did manage to publish a summary of the book, drawing on the concluding chapter that the last time I looked, namely yesterday, has received a grand total of 3 citations. This, I think, I'd like to think it was a contribution to understanding this question of, is a cooperative relationship with China, which we all think would be in everyone's best interest. How feasible is that? So I regret that that book was not published ever, but the summary, if you're interested, has been. And what I regard as my most path-breaking volume was the book that, again, Lisa mentioned on the period from 1945 to 1955, a critical decade, of course, in the descent of the US-China relationship from the World War II alliance to the Cold War distancing. This was innovative because it was a collaborative project between young Chinese and young American scholars, where Yuanming, Beida, and I decided that instead of having the Chinese scholars write about China and the American scholars write about America, we would reverse it so that the Chinese scholars wrote about the United States. Of course, the subtext was it would be, then they would be freer in those years to say what they really thought about a country other than their own, and have the American scholars write about China. It checks in as of yesterday at about 100 citations, which is hardly a astounding record. And that was about the same as an article that I wrote at about roughly the same time called From China with Disdain, which is one of my more embarrassing works. So again, no correlation between what I'm proud of and what I kind of regret I ever thought. We'll return to that in a moment because of what it says about my interests in the field. Now, you may have noticed that none of the publications that I just mentioned focus specifically on the Chinese economy or even on US-China economic relations. In fact, quite little of my output actually has. As I said, for one thing, I'm not an economist. Instead, in an age of specialization in the universities especially, I am a resolute generalist. I have written on a wide range of topics, pursuing the so-called sustained research agenda that I was wisely advised to follow, to identify and follow when I was a young faculty member at Stanford and defiantly ignored and refused to accept. That may have its strengths, may have its weaknesses, but it's what I have done. So I've written about a lot of things and done a lot of things. In addition, if you had to identify myself, I would not even say that I am a political scientist, even though my position was, before I started going to professional schools and teaching there, I see myself as a political historian. I like telling stories far more than I like building models. I like narratives rather than analysis data. What I try to do is to tell stories that have some kind of analytical bite, where we're applying concepts to make the history clearer, better understandable, and to identify some of the reasons for the errors that policymakers have made as they try to lead their countries and manage their international relationships. So my writing has been all over the place, just as my career has been all over the place in terms of where I've worked and what I've done. But still, looking at it, taking Saranovic's advice, trying to draw the threads of continuity out of my work, I find that there are some things that tie those papers and books all together. And so today I want to offer you what might be regarded as an intellectual history of my own. I'm going to focus on the questions that others and I were exploring at the time, rather than the answers that I gave. The answers tended, of course, to be time-based. The questions tend to be more enduring. Just last night at dinner back in Charlottesville, I learned for the first time, since we are in the Passover season, that asking questions is a key part of Passover Seders in every Jewish family. So maybe it is an appropriate day, an appropriate time to focus on the questions that we need to ask and not try to focus too much on the acts and the answers that we may temporarily give until the situation changes. I'm going to try to relate those questions to the broader trend in the evolving field of contemporary Chinese studies. And that approach that I'm taking today was also reflected in some of my writing, because I was constantly doing surveys of the field, asking about how the questions change and the answers change given changes in China, in the United States, and in the world. And as generations follow generations in the study of China, I find a particularly interesting issue. I won't have time in my prepared remarks to raise the final question in that area, and that is, are we on the verge of a new generation of analysis and study of China? My answer, if you want to ask me during the Q&A, will be that I'm quite concerned about the future of our field, whether it's economics or foreign policy or politics, for some of the obvious reasons that we might want to consider. So, as I looked at those themes, one of the most enduring ones, and produced what I regard as my favorite work because it was my first book. All the parents in the room know about the firstborn, how that's a particularly special child always. Although you love them all, the firstborn holds a special place in your heart because it is the first. And my first book is called Organizing China. And it was about the debates in the Chinese Communist Party about how to govern their country. That title, Organizing China, was not the title that I originally gave it. The first title was Getting Organized, after the essay by Mao on that subject called Get Organized, which laid out his view, which of course was very dominant for many, many years in China, ebb and flow, and the extent to which it was actually put into practice. But his views about the mass line, about political control, about rectification, indoctrination, collective leadership, and was, I think, what inspired me to take up this issue. This was a time in the 1970s when graduate students around the country were mining the Cultural Revolution documents, as biased and incomplete as they were, to write first cuts of issue area history, everything from public health to agriculture, to managing the industrial workforce, as well as something on foreign policy, although that was not the focus. And I thought that what was missing was the organizational issue in Chinese politics, which is the title of the dissertation on which this book was based. So as I said, my original title was Organizing China, but publishers, just like editors today, always have the last word. And so that title was rejected by Stanford University Press because they were worried that back in the days that books were largely sold in bricks and mortar stores as opposed to online, it would be put on the shelf with other, I'm not making this up, other self-help books. So it'll be the self-help issue section. Getting organized would be next to losing weight, managing your time, raising a successful child, and of course everybody would say, "Yeah, I want to get organized." And, oh my gosh, it's about China. What can I learn about that? So it was named differently. But the book was about the ways in which this was a major issue in Chinese politics, far more than organizational issues are in the United States. So it was really also aimed at the US domestic readership, domestic interests, asking the question of, are we as well organized as we should be? An issue that I think has become increasingly important over the years, not particularly important then, in the early 1980s when it was published. I also in that book identified another enduring theme, and that is to think dialectically rather than in a non-dualistic. But basically, the Chinese were managing a whole set of contradictions in their organizational life. The contradiction between having control over the bottom levels or lower levels of society and politics, but the need to allow a relatively free flow of information up to higher levels of decision making. That's a classic problem in every organization. They were grappling with some of the classic sort of pathologies of organization, especially government bureaucracies. The question of bureaucratic rigidity, the alienation of ordinary citizens from the bureaucrats that run their lives, the tendencies towards corruption, especially in a political economy system where the state has a great control over the economy. And so I saw this managing of these contradictions as being a theme that I thought should be applied not only to the study of Chinese organizations, but also to the study of China more generally. Now, interestingly, this book, Organizing China, seems to have been better received in China than in the US. It was seen by some scholars as overly complicated because I had so many different identified different approaches and patterns in managing these huge bureaucracies. But I've been told by diplomats from China, I hope that they were not simply being polite, that they had read it, that it was assigned in some of the courses that they took. They read it when they were doing their study at the higher party school, because they also felt this was an understudied topic that could not be discussed particularly frankly in China. And it would be interesting, at least, to see a foreign scholar try to grapple with it. What they thought of my analysis was never made clear to me. What they said was, we picked an important topic that we had not been able to think or talk very much about when we were in our formative years. But even before I published Organizing China, I had published an article in Asian Survey, the journal that was published, I think now as then at the University of California at Berkeley, that introduced another one of my enduring interests. And that was the ways in which foreigners, and especially Americans, try to understand China, whether as journalists, as policymakers, or scholars, and then convey that understanding to relevant audiences that they're trying to reach. The article both chronicled and then critiqued what I saw was a trend that now I would call one of disillusionment. It was a study of and critique of the visitors who went to China as China began to open after the Cultural Revolution. For those of you who have studied kind of the great works in the history of the Chinese Revolution and the Chinese Communist Party, they recognize the name Chalmers Johnson, the late Chalmers Johnson, University of California at Berkeley. His wife, Sheila Johnson, was an accomplished specialist on Japan and basically of mutual images in international affairs in her own right. And so she had written a book called To China with Love, which was basically what some scholars later called the years of revolutionary tourism, when basically those who admired the Maoist model, the Maoist ideal, this was, after all, began in the late 1960s and the student revolutions in Berkeley, Columbia, and other places. I have to say that I was a founding member of the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars at Stanford, CAS, we called it. And in fact, if you go and see their hyperbolic book called China, not just China, China! Exclamation point, inside the People's Republic, based on a study tour that they had made in the early years of revolutionary tourism. The chapter on the Cultural Revolution was literally dictated by me in a conference room at the Center for East Asian Studies at Stanford. Please don't read that, please don't, unless it's a negative example. I did better work later on when I wrote the chapter on the Cambridge history of China on the kind of Red Guard years of the Cultural Revolution. So they went to China, as Sheila said, about it with love, expecting to find the utopian paradise that Mao Zedong had promised and that many young Americans of that time hoped to see. They came away deeply disillusioned, deeply disappointed. Again, a standard pattern in American observations of China. I remember writing, just off the top of my head now, an article where I concluded that if we're going to try to avoid the cycle of illusionment and disillusionment, we'd better identify what happens and why we get illusioned in the first place. And I still say that. So basically what I did was a critique of this from China with disdain argument. It verged on, touched the boundaries, maybe crossed the boundaries of apology for the Maoist model and Maoist China. but it is what it is. I can't deny it's there, and it's embarrassingly one of my more cited articles. Hope it's being used as a negative example as it should be. But anyway. So that came even before organizing China, and it has established an interest in trying to understand how people, especially Americans, perceive and misperceive China. And we'll be returning to that throughout my remarks today. So, on Apple products, very, very sensitive to touch. More careful with that than I had. So the next thing that we were all beginning to ask, the next set of questions we asked, of course, were what was going to happen when Mao died? This was now in the early 1970s. Mao died in 1976. So there was an extensive literature trying to forecast the future of China in the post-Mao era. And in another embarrassing book or article, a paper, I tried to take that on. And basically, I argued that there would be a high degree of consensus and continuity as China entered the post-Mao era. Basically, I was misled by what I thought was the power of the system of political education and indoctrination. And of course, the propaganda apparatus, which was pumping out the great successes of China under the Maoist model. So for a company that I think still exists across the river, Mathematica, which was a forecasting and analytic firm, I wrote this paper that said that basically the most likely scenario, by the way, when you do forecasts, always include probabilities, because you can never be proven wrong unless you say there's 100% chance or 0% chance. You can say, well, of course, it's low probability, but I just said that it could still happen, or just the opposite. So at least I gave a probabilistic analysis, but I confess the most likely probability, I said, was basically continuing the status quo under new leadership. The great Lucian Pye of MIT, a giant in the field of both comparative politics and the study of China, in his usual gracious way, I actually know him fairly well, respected him a great deal, said Harry has presented such an eloquent case for continuity. I don't quite know why I'm totally unpersuaded by it. And of course, Lucian was right and I was wrong. But once we realized that there was going to be substantial change, then the question would be, how far would it go and in what direction? And again, I was cautious, unnecessarily so, for the reasons that I have mentioned. So that basically, I began to argue that there might be some kind of a synthesis of the Maoist and the more, I don't know what's called rational legal or standard approach to organizational management and to economic policy. So I talked instead about the idea that there might be something that I called revolutionary pragmatism that would be a synthesis of these two things. Wrong again. So I tended in those years to overstate the possibility for continuity in China and to understand the great pressure for change that was coming from society and within the party itself. Even though I had, by pure chance, the opportunity to experience personally the huge demonstrations, first in Beijing and then in Shanghai. In 1976, that welcomed the fall of the Gang of Four, and therefore the end of the Maoist era. Shanghai, it was absolute ecstasy on the streets, and somehow I managed to tune all that out. Didn't see what a force that was for more fundamental change. Still, I was predicting far more continuity than I imagined. This is no longer era. Well. So the question is, what would it be? There was going to be more change than I had anticipated, but it was also going to involve the kind of back and steps forward and backward that we have seen since then. At the time, I think that there was a sense that China would follow perhaps the path of the Soviet Union as it fundamentally marketized and privatized its economy, and through what was then called the Big Bang, very sudden and comprehensive change. I was never sure that that was going to happen because I thought that would be an overly complex approach. So although I didn't kind of pioneer the idea that China would try to cross the river by feeling for the stones at the bottom of the riverbed, I did have a sense that it would be, again, more complicated than that. I also was strongly influenced by a young scholar, a female scholar in Mongolia, who at a time of Mongolia debating the degree of economic and political reform, asked me the rhetorical question, why are the two foreigners who did the greatest damage to my country people with the same initials, JS? I said, what do you mean for JS? Joseph Stalin and Jeffrey Sachs. In other words, the idea that you should go all out towards privatization, marketization, was simply a mistake that the Mongols wish they had never made. So the Big Bang did not seem particularly likely to me. I can't say that I anticipated what would happen, but it was clear that it would be a more dialectical approach. There would be what one scholar has called growing out of the plan. It would be a gradual process rather than something spectacular. And it would be a blend, again, a dialectical approach that would combine what they hoped would be the best of the market, the best of the we'll call it the plan, the regulation of the economy, and so forth. There was, of course, the huge interruption of the Tiananmen crisis of 1989. And then the question was how far back it would go. And again, there were some very dramatic forecasts in the United States that were obviously based on what was being said at the time. But I took my cue from a friend, one of the people who had worked with me on that edited volume on US-China relations, whose father was in a position in the Chinese bureaucracy to know. And he said that Deng Xiaoping was persuaded by those who said, if you start going backwards, especially in the countryside, you'll not be able to employ the vast number of underemployed peasants you have to. You're going to be in big trouble. You have no choice but to sustain basically private plots, township and village enterprises, free markets. You have no choice. And as we know, Deng Xiaoping was persuaded by that. So despite the fact that things went backward more in the political sphere, there were also those who thought at the time that China would necessarily follow the approach of Taiwan and would gradually first pluralize and then democratize politically. And to give credit to another G.W. Elliott's colleague, Bruce Dixon, who wrote at the time that this was simply not going to happen because of the resistance from the Leninist system, fear of what would result, and that therefore it would be very, very limited political reform by that definition. And again, I was a little more optimistic. I talked about the halting progress of pluralism, which is quite guarded, but still emphasized the progress. And again, Bruce was far more right than I was. So I'm sharing with you some of the things that I got wrong when trying to answer the very important questions that we were all trying to raise. So those were some of the themes that I dealt with in those years. Then as we got into, this jumping forward quite a bit, but into the 2010s, I began to focus more on the US-China relationship. And as Richard said, one of my favorite books and one that has been very widely cited. Basically a fragile relationship as US-China relations from 1972. There's a vague title. Never put an end point on your study, even though there has to be one, because it will limit sales. I regret that because it sounds like it comes up to the present and it doesn't. But I was then trying to identify what the likely outcome of the US-China relationship was going to be. I can't say that I got all of it right. But it was very much going back to that moment in my introductory micromath class when I saw that the implication was that when there was economic change as a result of competition, whether domestic or foreign, there would be a smooth and frictionless process by which workers would be laid off, factories would be closed down, they would be able easily to find other jobs. And of course, that was not what has happened in the US-China relationship, but instead there was a growing anger and frustration that the impact of the US-China economic relationship, one that Stephen Roach had called a codependency relationship, not interdependent, but codependent, in the exactly that negative connotation that the term implies in social psychology. That basically the two sides use the relationship to kind of cover up some very serious imbalances in their domestic economies. You're familiar with them if you study China. The Chinese have saved too much relative to the GDP for very obvious reasons. The lack of a social safety net, cautious society that has suffered much from economic disruption in the past. They therefore, by definition, consume less than most other countries at their stage of development. That they export too much, again, relative to the norm, import too little relative to comparative advantage, and that these imbalances were what caused the trade deficit. It was not just, in fact, not mainly, the unfair trade practices and the lack of reciprocity that people complained about, but basically the idea that if you have these domestic imbalances, and I'll take my hat to a former Brookings colleague, Ed Linder, who worked on the Japanese economy, who showed me that, showing my lack of intuitive instinct here with economics, I try to explain to my class every year how there is an accounting identity between trade imbalances and basically domestic imbalances. I can never explain it without writing it out word for word, because I just don't. I understand it, but I don't get it if you understand that distinction. So the only question was, with whom would the United States run its large trade deficits? And there you could argue that trade regulations and practices made a difference. But given the economic imbalances in both countries, China was going to run a surplus, the US was going to run a deficit, and that this would have the consequences in the United States that we all know about, and proved very, very damaging to the relationship. So one of the most important works I've written more recently was, I'm happy to say, published in the Elliott School Journal, the Washington Quarterly. I hope it's still part of the Elliott input. Glad to hear that. And it was under the title, "Has U.S.-China Policy Failed?" Has, I'm now calling it broken engagement. Was engagement broken? Because it was unable to manage the growing differences between the two countries, not just on economics, but on a variety of other issues, human rights, obviously, China's positioning of itself in the Asia-Pacific region, economically and from a security point of view. And I came to the, again, cautious conclusion that there was debate about this, but that the most prevalent point of view was it had failed, or at least very disappointing results, and that the debate was what would replace it. There was quite a serious debate at that time. There were those in the United States, especially in China also, that, well, it might have been disappointing to both sides, but as the Chinese put it, there is no alternative to engagement. Just like they now say, there is no alternative to cooperation. Well, ladies and gentlemen, yes, there is an alternative, and we've experienced it. And that was basically the break in the US-China relationship under President Trump. And the more surprising phenomenon, especially to the Chinese, that has not been reversed under Joe Biden. They had come to the confident conclusion that, looking at the track record of American presidents, starting with Ronald Reagan, who talked and forecast of today, about restoring officiality to the US relationship with Taiwan, from Ronald Reagan all the way up to what they hoped would happen with Donald Trump. It had happened with Bill Clinton, that American presidents would complain, they talk tough, they threaten China, but then something would happen. Something actually, in most cases, China engineered, which was a demonstration of China's use of force in a place like the Taiwan Strait. That would basically say, you need to have a good relationship with us. So basically, you better back away from your unreasonable acts. They were confident this would happen. But They hoped, of course, that the demonstration of force after Nancy Pelosi's visit to the island would have the same effect. It has not. So basically, if our policy is broken, so has been theirs. And this is talk later today and in the afternoon session, I think, about the implications for the U.S.-China relationship going forward. That article that I wrote was quite controversial because there was a significant group of people in the United States. They're often called panda huggers. I think that's unfair. Shirley and I use a different phrase. It's called keepers of the flame to try to keep that flame alive. That there is no alternative to the engagement policy. And sooner or later, we will have to realize that. That might be true in the long run. We'll see. I have my reservations about that, but it certainly has not happened anytime immediately. So right now, the issues are in terms of the U.S.-China relationship. How do we manage decoupling? How far is it going to go? Farther than most people had anticipated. So that's another area that I am exploring. One final set before I turn to some of the new issues on my agenda, and that is how do we evaluate this quite successful economic development model that the Chinese chose by trial and error, but by the sense that we have to do it experimentally, cautiously, not in an all-encompassing, one-shot, big bang way. How do we evaluate that? And of course, it's been called, there's a litany, the Chinese economic miracle. No country in the world has lifted as many hundreds of millions of people out of poverty as the Chinese have. This is an economic miracle. And in an article that I published in Taiwan, and obviously here as well, I basically argued it is not an economic miracle. Miracles are things that cannot be explained by our understanding of how the world works. Usually the argument is that it's some kind of divine intervention about how the Roman Catholic Church decides who can become a saint. They have to have performed or experienced a miracle. It cannot be explained by normal science. There's nothing about what the Chinese did that cannot be explained by normal economic science. Basically what they did was they got the message. They understood that they needed to do the same kinds of things that the other Asian tigers had accomplished as they began to make the move towards, in their case, labor-intensive export-led growth, or in the case of China, a greater role for the market for private ownership, less control at that time by the party and the government. There's nothing miraculous about that. What was miraculous was a political miracle, not an economic. That basically the Chinese leadership under Deng Xiaoping was willing to make that break from the past that I had falsely predicted would be very, very unlikely, if not impossible. But they were able to make that decision among themselves and then to basically persuade the rest of the senior leadership, the rest of the party, to follow along. This was a case of what scholars in leadership call transformational leadership. Just making big change. Transforming what was considered to be kind of acceptable or desirable policy on the part of key sectors of the population. So I keep using that concept because my next thinking has been the new problems that China is experiencing in its domestic economic life. You are familiar with all of them, so all I have to do is tick them off in no particular order. These include, first of all, still a stubbornly high savings rate and a stubbornly low rate of consumption, largely again because of the aging population and the lack of a robust social safety. At the same time, there is demographic decline of an unprecedented sort, the causes of which are extremely interesting, complicated, perhaps deserve further study. But the fact is that the Chinese population, which my day, we were worried about it exploding under basically Mao's policy of the more Chinese, the better, imploding as a result, not just of the one-child policy, but also, again, a variety of sociological factors, economic factors, like the high cost of housing, that are leading young families to decide, why bother? Too expensive, too difficult. We've got to really, concentrate on basically just one, if any, in order to give them the best opportunity. So this is a very, very serious challenge. And indeed, most demographers would say that for a country to reverse that dramatic decline in birth rates, other than after a war or a discrete event, no one's ever been able to do it. So if they can reverse this and get the birth rate growing again, that would indeed be perhaps described as a socioeconomic miracle. It has not happened before, and nothing that they've tried to do so far, such as basically encouraging counseling for couples. The problem is a lack of fertility. There may be some truth to that. It doesn't explain the totality of it. Their policies so far have not had any practical effect, as far as I know, though it could be too early to tell. So you have the demographic decline, you have the low savings rate, you have the high level of indebtedness of both local governments and private companies. You have the increasingly dire consequences of climate change. So you have a mounting series of problems that echo in some ways, but are not entirely the same. In fact, they're enormously different from the problems that China faced in the past. How well will they do? There's also the question for both China and the rest of us of how China is going to interact with the rest of the world. And again, it's a familiar list. I don't have the answers, only the questions. Will China be successful in the so-called dual circulation policy, which is a way of saying, among other things, that we want to become more self-sufficient in key technologies and components and materials for the obvious reasons. So we're afraid the rest of the world is trying to squeeze us, and so we have to become autarkic to the greatest degree possible. How successful will they be in terms of what they do trade? How successful will they be in making the renminbi a world convertible currency and be able to settle accounts in their own currency rather than using the US dollar? How successful will all those efforts be? And finally, the last thread that I have begun to work on, that is its origins way back when I was at Brookings, when I wrote an article on the concept of Greater China, that idea that there would be a more kind of regional, if not global, concept of interactions among Chinese societies, starting with China, of course, but including Hong Kong, Taiwan, overseas Chinese communities elsewhere. I've become, because Shirley and I live in both Hong Kong and Taiwan now, and maintain homes in both, and we're, to put it mildly, very disturbed by what we're seeing in both places. So what is going to happen with regard to China's policies towards those two territories? One it has recovered, one it insists it will recover during the great leader's lifetime, that's the way I would put it. What is going to be the outcome of that contradiction between what the people of Hong Kong and Taiwan seem to want and what the Chinese leadership they insist they must have? And so that is something that I'm following now. So in short, that's been my intellectual journey. And I fancy Saran for saying that you might find something interesting done in the past. And I found both the good and bad, maybe the such will certainly be embarrassing. But I appreciate the chance to share with you what my intellectual journey has been so far. I think it reflects a broader journey of those of us who study China have been undertaking, and a journey that, of course, will continue. Look forward to your questions, and I will have a panel later this afternoon on more specifically on the US-China relationship. So we'll have a conversation there as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for a very insightful presentation and overview of your intellectual journey. If I may say something about the intellectual journey, in 2005, when I arrived in GW after you hired me, gave me a job, you introduced me to the world of US-China relations. And at the time, I think I even told you when you invited me to my first event in DC on US-China relations, I made a disclaimer. I said, Harry, I am an economist. I don't study China. And
I thought you were going to say don't study US-China. What you just said is really profound. That's why the basically the declining portions of so-called area studies in key disciplines like political science and economics is a real problem. That's what you just said is really sad to do.
And then what you said back to me was not yet. And I had to say that was right. Over the last 18 years, I have been studying China more and more. Not a China specialist, but I've been studying China more and more. And it's almost inevitable to study China now, being a trade economist. So I guess I'll take just the privilege of asking the first question while the audience formulate their questions. So a few years ago, I made an observation that a lot of the issues surrounding US-China relations start with trade, tariff, technology, Taiwan, and five also President Trump. So of all the issues here, right? Is it fair to say that trade, I'm a trade economist, so I have to ask about trade policy has taken sort of backseat among the various issues, technology competition, national security, Taiwan, or maybe trade and tariff have become an instrument from both sides to achieve these other objectives in their on their agenda. Is that a fair statement to say that trade is not a core, or rather an instrument?
Well, again, I encourage everyone to think dialectically. It's both, as it so often is. And we don't need to make these choices. It's hard to say two things where it's a kind of a mutually constitutive process, which is the most important. Hard to say. Maybe we can try to answer that question, but it's not easy to do so. The Chinese like to talk about the way in which trade has been weaponized. And so the idea that trade is being used as the instrument for waging this competition or the confrontation in these other areas is absolutely correct. What I think is equally interesting is the way in which that arena that we call maybe trade or economic relationships is becoming more and more diverse. So there's more and more aspects. Of course, in the early years, it was largely, and we go back to the 1950s, when we had a near complete embargo on trade with China. I remember that time very, very well, when basically before normalization and the then provisional granting of most favored nation status to China, the biggest items in the American import agenda were, as I would call it, postage stamps and publications. So people could subscribe to what was then the Peking Review, and they could buy postage stamps from China, but also nothing else. Basically, travel was restricted by both sides. And the wonderful comparison that Mike Oxenberg, one of my mentors at Stanford, and the China person on the NSC under Brzezinski and the Carter administration came up with, was that before the American ping pong team visited China in the first openings of the relationship in 1971, and inaugurating what has been known as ping pong diplomacy ever since. As he said, until that team visited China, more Americans had set foot on the moon than had been to the People's Republic of China, and with the qualifier, with the permission of the two governments. Some people, one famous scholar, actually got a yacht going up the Yangtze River, jumped off the yacht and swam desperately to shore. So eager was he to visit the People's Republic, but of course he was arrested and deported. So there were a few who snuck in. I don't know about the other direction, but it's a striking comparison. That's how distant it was. So basically, trade was virtually nil. Personal connections were greatly attenuated, if not destroyed. And while we started with the Trump tariffs on imports, especially of aluminum and steel, and then of course, I guess what we call white goods, the kind of appliances and so forth, it extended across the board on tariffs. The Chinese reciprocated to a degree. But above all, it has now gotten to the point where export restrictions are as important as import restrictions. And of course, we have growing attempts to regulate investment, direct investment, and now portfolio investment. So the restriction is going across a wider and wider range of economic relationships. And so this is the way in which it's now called, this wonderful euphemism, economic statecraft, means using these economic instruments, these trade, investment, technology sharing instruments In the university, as we all know, there's now this concept of deemed exports, which basically means studying something. If you learn something in a university, especially in the STEM or tech areas, that is now regarded as a deemed export that therefore can be regulated and restricted. So it's really a wide-ranging now economic warfare, I'll use that term, that is quite unprecedented, even in the fraught U.S.-China relationship past.
So let me, yes, Albert, let me open the floor to the audience. Albert, our first speaker.
He's not Albert, that's Bert Title. I recognize him.
Hi, I'm Albert Keitel. I teach a course on the Chinese economy here at the Elliott School, but it's wonderful to hear your review of yourself and all the humility. I'm struck by the humility in having incorrectly predicted continuity. And so today there is a sense that there's a real break in continuity with Xi Jinping. And yet there's a lot of signs that their policies are really from the Hu Jintao or even earlier period, whether it's industrial policy or concerns about security. So, and the contradictions of China having also to react to outside events, in particular the Trump and Biden administration. So what do you think about your prediction about continuity or non-continuity going forward now, particularly to the degree to which domestic US politics seem to be driving our international relations with China?
Thank you, Bert. I'd like to pay tribute to Bert. Bert, in those days that I first got to know him, ran something called Rock Creek Research, was that right? And it was an attempt to really make sense of Chinese economic data, to really try to iron it out, make it more believable, or accurate, and to put it in a form that people could readily use. So, as I mentioned, the people in Washington from whom I learned more about economics, it was Bert who taught me more about specifically the Chinese economy. I haven't forgotten, and it's great to see you here. Changing continuity, I should have mentioned that because as a separate theme, I touched on it, as you said, but I think that is one of the areas that is problematic for observers because, again, it has to be looked at as a complex answer, not a simple one. Perhaps the best example of false continuity are the familiar claims that Xi Jinping is another Mao. Of course, he is the desire to build personal power, to rule for as long as he cares to basically now develop something called Xi Jinping thought, and to use that as the basis for the political education system. All of these are continuities, but there are huge differences as well, which is why this issue is both interesting, but very often very, very poorly done. Perhaps the biggest, at least the original, and what seems to be discontinuous and then change, you begin to see as the saying goes, history from Mark Twain, supposedly, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So it's a kind of echoes of the past in modern form. Basically, Xi Jinping was most different from Mao in the area originally of political organization, my key topic. Because basically, as he exercised greater control over the party and government bureaucracies and over Chinese society, he did not at all do what Mao did, which was to mobilize what in my book I called relying on the unreliable. Rely on the people who are both the most alienated and therefore the most angry to criticize the party and get it to shape up. Best example, the Cultural Revolutions, the Red Guards who were disenchanted with the education systems they encountered. Before that, 100 Flowers and the intellectuals. Mao acknowledged they were unreliable, but he felt giving them an example, an experience of revolution would bring them around. Xi Jinping is not like that. If you want a comparison, Xi Jinping is far more Liu Shaoqi than he is Mao. And indeed, there's a Jessica Keats at Middlebury Bennington College, Middlebury, is writing work on basically Xi Jinping's attempt to gain control over the party. And it is pure Liu Shaoqi in slightly different form. It's work teams. to send out the work teams to force not only compliance with the directions of the central working groups in Beijing, but also to get them to coordinate better with from one sector, one shitong to another. So there's both continuity and change, and getting that mix right and understanding how you define those continuities is, again, a challenging task. Thanks for the question. You would also say, of course, that much of what she is doing in terms of economic policy is far more Maoist than Dengist, although Deng was never pure in terms of wanting to open unrestrictedly. She always talked about a screen over the open window to prevent flies from flying in. I think that she is somewhat departing from Xi Jinping as well, and therefore from Deng Xiaoping as well, and returning to some of those autarkic views that Mao had. So there's a mix of continuity and change, which is fun to explore.
One question.
Hi, Harry. This is Hilton. You may recall we had a number of interactions back in the 90s. So I have two questions. One, are you really sure that American business interests are in line with your notion of disengagement? Because the trade data doesn't show disengagement. In fact, the trade imbalance has reached a new peak, and businesses seem as eager as ever to get back into the China market in the anticipation that it may grow. So one could interpret this somewhat differently, which is the interest in China is in tandem with the degree to which the Chinese economy is expected to grow. So if there's going to be growth, there's going to be interest. The problem is that there may not be growth, and the data significantly inflates the prospects of growth. So I wanted your thoughts on that. And the second is going back to your comment about the similarities between the Chinese approach to modernization and the East Asian one. I wonder if you might acknowledge that there is a significant difference in terms of the strategy for globalization, because when the East Asian tigers started to take off, it was by moving entire industries over to Korea or to Japan. China did something very different. It inserted itself into global value chains. It brought the multinationals into China and made China a part of this global value chain. That's why it's very difficult to extract, to disengage. And so that's a very different strategy than I think is characteristic of the earlier takeoff of the smaller East Asian countries.
Both excellent questions. And as I've said, I think I'm better at asking questions than giving answers, because the answers are necessarily very, very complicated. But let me simply say this about decoupling and about the mood of the business community in general. Elisa, and I'll continue kind of describing my occupational and intellectual journey. Elisa mentioned that I was for a little almost 2 years working at Eurasia Group doing political risk assessment. And the firm, the one that's headed by Ian Bremmer, probably is more well-known personally than the firm is organizationally, had gotten a commission or a contract from the Japanese Economic Trade Research Organization to do a study of the risks for businesses in China, looking forward, as I recall, 15 years ago, and I was asked to direct that study group. To make a long story short, what we saw were significant risks that we felt should inspire businesses, maybe especially Japanese businesses, but all businesses, to basically think as to whether they were becoming too dependent on China, whether for markets, whether for sources of supply, whether those were resources or whether they were components or finished goods. We basically advocated not complete decoupling, but a kind of partial decoupling, or at least diversification. And the Japanese picked up on this, a phrase that we use, was called the China plus one strategy, that you would not want to become overly dependent on China in any of those dimensions. In fact, the way I like to put it now is we put the word dependent back in the word interdependence. That obviously interdependence means both sides are dependent on the other, and that dependency can provide a risk, just as the codependence that Steve Roach talked about also involved certain risks because of the unhealthy nature of that relationship. At the time, the issue was, and it gets to your comparative question, basically, if it's China plus one, what would the other one be? And the debate in Japan at the time was between two kind of extremes. One was Vietnam, the other was India. Vietnam was seen as a slightly different version of China, but very, very similar in many ways. Much smaller, obviously, as a market, as an economy, but still the same kind of structure, some similarities in culture. And certainly the Vietnamese economy has taken off extremely well. You know, my first visit to Vietnam and going from the airport then to downtown Hanoi and seeing all these small shop kind of light manufacturing operations, just full force coming in the middle of the night off the plane. And I remember thinking China's in trouble. They are just going to cherry pick the kind of the simple things that the Chinese have been doing at a lower cost, probably comparable quality. India was kind of the opposite. This was this big democratic, those days, not now of course, democratic gangling democracy. And the sense was that, well, India is always plagued by the so-called Hindu rate of growth. Others were cynically saying it's going to be like Brazil. It's the country of the future and always will be the country of the future. But it's a hedge. It's so different that it's the likely hedge. So I think this question of the similarities and differences between China's model and other models is a very good one. The question of decoupling. The mantra that many use, as you thought, when the term was first mentioned, was it's impossible. The supply chains are simply too important and too robust. You point out correctly that nothing has changed the trade imbalance. But since that imbalance, as I've said, is so, again, the phrase I understand is by accounting identity, is so related to domestic imbalances that are resistant to change, even in China, I think to Roach's surprise, that those trade balances are going to continue to exist. Imbalances. The only question is with whom? But given the size of the American economy, the size of the Chinese production capacity, especially now in key areas where people that I talk to in business are now talking about a whole different range of industries in which China has acquired a oligopoly or oligopsony position. Is simply the only, if not monopoly, the major producer of solar panels, for example, and other technologies, especially medical technologies. We've learned, Shirley and I, in a recent discussion with hospital authorities and the medical industry in various parts of the world, that it just there's no alternative at this point. So decoupling will be difficult, but I'm surprised at how far it has been gone, and it's both from the top down and the bottom up. I'm more interested, given my intellectual journey, as you know, I'm interested in the bottom up. And basically how American individuals are turning away from China. How some Americans will get, the Schwarzman College program in Beijing, at Tsinghua University, that was intended to be the Rhodes Scholar of China program. Basically, we know Americans, as well as, of course, people from other countries, who are now turning it down because they're very worried about having that on their list. When they try to get a job in sensitive areas back in the United States, or they simply don't want to go. It used to be because of the pollution. Beijing is doing a good job of that currently, most days. But the idea that this is an area where it will be difficult to gain unfettered access to the internet, to Google, to various social media posts, that there will be limits for the Scholar program, for example. You cannot invite non-Schwarzman College, at least in the day we visited, into the campus and the dormitory to see you. You can only go there, see them outside. Both sides are restricting it from the top down and from the bottom up. And I think that we are seeing some partial decoupling by the American business community as well. Some is now concerned about risk, and some is being required, as Maggie has reminded us, by the basically weaponization of trade and investment policy. So we're all aware of the requirements now that basically mutual fund pension funds basically begin to reduce their the share of their holdings in our Chinese listed companies. So I think that here, this is a good question, and I can answer, as you can see, put it this way, cynically, you can see what you want to see. If you want to see decoupling, you can see decoupling. If you want to see the resilience of supply chains and marketing chains and all the rest, you can see that too. So it's a story that we need to investigate, and I'm not sure even now what my answer.
Thank you very much. Given the time, I'm afraid we will have to move the discussion to this afternoon's panel, which Harry would also participate in, and so we can move on with the rest of our agenda. Thank you all. Let's give Harry a big applause.